Welcome, my Old Testament introduction students. This is another video in which we are going to kind of touch upon a number of things. I want to say a couple things about Judges, having just done your assignment. I'm going to briefly tell you a few things about Ruth and then jump in a little bit with the 1st and 2nd Samuel stuff. Let's just start off with a couple of comments on the Judges stuff. I had to read the story of Jephthah. I really want to touch upon that last question. After reading his story, what was your opinion of the man? Almost everybody, and in fact, I think everybody, basically said he seemed like a pretty good, godly guy, more than not. And I think you misread the story. And you have to realize, and I'm going to hammer this home, when we're reading Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, the Deuteronomistic history, you have to remember that they were written in their final form during the exile, and the overriding question they were trying to answer is what went wrong? Why did we end up in exile? We thought we were God's people. How did this happen? And so when you read these books, you have to realize that as they're telling the story of their history, they're answering that question, what went wrong? They're going to point out the bad things. And so, for example, when we get to the story of Jephthah, the writer is not trying to tell you that this guy is an awesome person. He's saying that God used him, but his very description of the man, the very description of many of the things he did are really problematic. And so, as if to say, the ultimate hero in these stories is God. He's using deeply flawed people. So don't confuse the deeply flawed people to be some kind of paragons of virtue. And so therefore, with Jephthah, we're told he obviously had a rough childhood, really problematic, treated horribly. When it says that he brought together a bunch of worthless men around him, he was essentially... He got kicked out of his town and he became his own little warlord or gang leader. He was a tough guy. You would not want to meet him in a back alley. So therefore, as the story goes, he is asked back to fight against the Ammonites, and you get the story there of what happened. But then after, there's a number of problematic things that happen. His vow to sacrifice the first thing that comes out of his house. A good reader will notice that at no point does God tell him to do that, which tells you something about his understanding of the God of Israel. He's still thinking in more or less pagan terms. Pagan gods wanted child sacrifices, and even though he is being called by the God of Israel to do this, his lens is still kind of pagan, which is problematic, which is why he makes the vow. And therefore, when he sacrifices his own daughter, that's bad. That is really bad. And the writer of Judges doesn't feel like he needs to tell you that's bad because it should be obvious. And another thing is after he fights the Ammonites and he gets into that conflict with his fellow Israelites, the Ephraimites, people from Ephraim, the way he handles that tension is also problematic. Because if you read all of Judges, a couple chapters earlier, the story of Gideon, when he fights the Midianites and he goes off and fights the Midianites, after that happens, there's this little segment where the Ephraimites, the men of Ephraim, come to Gideon and they're really mad that he didn't call them to fight. But the way he calms the tensions and he's a good politician, he smooths things over and is able to avoid conflict. Unlike Jephthah, who basically says, you want to fight me? Let's fight. And he goes out and kills 42,000 of them. Not good. And so when you read anything in Judges, don't gloss over the problematic things. They're there for a reason. They're there to answer the question, what went wrong? And therefore, what you see the writer of Judges doing is like, even when God had brought up judges to help us when we fell away into idolatry, even the judges weren't that great all the time. If you read Gideon has a huge fear problem. Samson has problems of his own. If you read that story, that's pretty interesting. So that's the one thing. When you read these stories, and as we get into First, Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, don't project onto these stories kind of a simplistic Sunday school version that you might have grown up with. The depiction of these people is very realistic. They're deeply flawed, and you have to wrestle with their deep flaws and reconcile that even though God is doing these great things, he's using very deeply flawed people. Okay, the second thing with the book of Ruth. If you look in your textbook, the book of Ruth chapter they have is like 2 pages long. So there's no point for me to give you questions on that. The big thing to realize about the book of Ruth, let me just look something up here. The big thing to realize about the book of Ruth from the textbook is basically the kinsman redeemer idea, and I don't have my book in front of me. The kind of how it feeds into the genealogy of David, basically. But what I'm going to do, instead of giving you questions on the book of Ruth, I'm going to instead right now just kind of give you an overview of what it is. It's only 4 chapters long. It's up to you if you read it. I hope you do, because I'm going to talk about it right now. Most people, they think they know the story of Ruth, and generally speaking, you probably do. But there are a number of really interesting things in the story that I want to point out. Okay? The story itself is divided up into 4 sections. Pretty much each chapter is its own section. It's divided up pretty well. And the story is about this Jewish woman, this Israelite woman who lives in Bethlehem, Naomi. And basically, long story short, her husband dies. She takes her 2 sons. They travel to Moab. Her sons marry these 2 Moabite women, Ruth and her sister, I think Oprah. Interesting. But then the sons die. And then Naomi decides to travel back to Bethlehem to be with her own people. She's just going to live the rest of her life as a sad widow, get ready to die. And Ruth, though, insists on going with Naomi and taking care of her. So Ruth voluntarily leaves her homeland to go with her mother-in-law and care for her in Bethlehem. Okay? That's how it starts. And we're told, and here's an interesting thing, in the Hebrew Bible, the book of Ruth is not after the book of Judges. The book of Ruth is in the writing section. It's in a whole different section of the Hebrew Bible. But the reason why it is put after Judges in our English Bibles is because in the book of Ruth, it says this story happened during the time of the Judges. So that's why it's where it is in our English Bibles. But that being said, so anyway, Ruth goes back with Naomi to Bethlehem, and Ruth starts to look for a job to help care for Naomi. And what her job is in that culture is she finds the certain fields that have been harvested, and she goes with a bunch of people who glean the fields. They're allowed to go glean the fields and pick up any scraps for themselves. And it turns out in chapter 2 that she starts gleaning in the field of a man named Boaz. And Boaz basically takes note of her. You can tell he thinks she's pretty hot stuff. And he tells his workers, hey, make sure you leave a little extra, dump a little extra seed and wheat on the field so she can pick it up to care for her, okay? And he invites her to eat with them. He's a gracious host. You could probably tell he's really interested. That's chapter 2. Now, it really gets interesting in chapters 3 and 4, because what happens is at the end of chapter 2, basically, or at the beginning of chapter 3, when Ruth goes home to tell Naomi what she's been doing, Naomi basically says, oh, how was your day? Ruth says, it's been great. I gleaned in a field of this guy named Boaz. He let me eat with him, gave me some extra food. And Naomi says, Boaz, I know that guy. He's a relative. And Naomi comes up with this idea for Ruth. Basically, she says, Ruth, you need to make sure he marries you. You need to rope that guy in. And here's how you do it. And Naomi tells Ruth, and this is where English translations kind of gloss over things, to Boaz and his men are busy harvesting. They're staying at the threshing floor, kind of where they're doing their stuff. They're sleeping at the threshing floor. So this is what you do, Ruth. Go in the middle of the night to where all the men are, find Boaz, and then go up to him and uncover his feet. And when he wakes up, tell her that you're interested, and maybe he'll try to marry you. Obviously, there's more to it. Read the story itself. It's not that long. And Ruth does that. Now, it sounds kind of like when I remember reading this as a kid, like that's kind of odd, going into where he's sleeping and uncovering his feet. In Hebrew, they have a couple, like in English, they use euphemisms. Like, for example, in English, in America, if you need to relieve yourself, you will often say, I have to go to the bathroom. You're not really going to bathe. We all know what you're going to do, but you're not going to want to just be vulgar and say what you're going to do. You kind of gloss over, and I'm going to the bathroom, and we all know. That's kind of what uncovering one's feet is a reference to. Basically, if a lot of times, not all the times, but a lot of times, it depends on the context, if a man's feet is uncovered, that means his naughty places are showing. So what you get here in Ruth is told by Naomi to go into the threshing floor while he's sleeping and basically let him know that if you marry me, I'm going to keep you happy. And it works. And so Boaz decides he wants to marry Ruth, but unfortunately because of the laws of the time, the law is if your husband dies, and her husband had died, the next of kin is first in line to have the obligation to marry you. And there was another guy, another relative in line before Boaz. And so what you get in chapter 4 is Boaz goes to that guy, says, hey, there's this woman, Ruth. She was married to so-and-so. You're next in line. Do you want to marry her? And the guy basically says, well, I'm already married. So they make a deal, and Boaz gets to marry Ruth, and they get married, and they have a son. And then at the very end of Ruth, you find out that son is, I think, the grandfather or great-grandfather of King David. So the point of the story is to tell a little bit about David's ancestry. Also, which is important to realize, that she's a Moabite. And so it's this acknowledgement that God even uses the Moabites for his greater purposes. Now, that's the story, and that's kind of the interesting thing that most people don't get about the story. But the point overall is Boaz acts as what they call a kinsman redeemer. You can read about that in the 2-page chapter, to redeem Ruth. And therefore, he acts as, he kind of does what God does with Israel. Okay? And so that's kind of the point. It's a nice little story. It's when you just read it, it's a fun story to read. There's that little nugget of theology in there is important. So, like I said, that's just a good story. There's not much to tell you about other than that. The next thing you're going to be doing is going through the chapter of 1st and 2nd Samuel. And 1st and 2nd Samuel is really fascinating. And I love going over all as much as I can in a classroom setting. We take a good week going through this, but I'm not going to spend a week doing a video. So you're going to want to read the chapter, do the background stuff, and I'm going to right now just very briefly give you an overview of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Again, I can't go into every detail. On the files that I'm going to have available to you, I've written out a summary of many the major chunks of First and Second Samuel. So, hopefully you can read that and appreciate the narrative more. Basically, First Samuel starts with Samuel and then goes on from there to talk about the kingship of Saul. Really, First Samuel, more than anything, is about the kingship of Saul. And in the middle of the kingship of Saul, we're introduced to David. And the second half of First Samuel is like one big chase scene between Saul and David. Second Samuel is all about the reign of David. So if you want to keep it very simple, First Samuel is primarily about Saul. Second Samuel is primarily about David. The reason why they're called First and Second Samuel is because Samuel was the prophet who anointed both of them. All right. The way First Samuel is laid out is not too hard to understand. The first 3 chapters were introduced to Samuel. The birth of Samuel, his being raised by the priest Eli, and his calling. Okay, that's chapters 1 through 3. And there's a lot more to it, but what you see is the corruption in Israel at the time. Eli, even though he himself was a good, honest priest, he had raised sons who were pretty horrible, and they were corrupt priests, and they did horrible things as priests. And because of that, God tells Eli, because you didn't raise your kids right, your family you're going to die, and your family will no longer be priests for me. I'm going to raise up somebody else. That new guy is going to be Samuel. That's first 3 chapters. Chapters 4 through 7 is what I call the Ark Adventures. And again, this shows not only the corruption that's going on in Israel, but also how God can take care of himself. And it's really simple to understand the story. The narrative, it's a fun story to read. Chapter 4, the Israelites are fighting the Philistines, and the Israelites, before a certain battle, they ask that the Ark of the Covenant be brought into the camp. Kind of like a good luck charm, which is not a good way to treat the Ark of the Covenant. And Eli's 2 sons bring the Ark in, and there's much rejoicing, but then they go to battle, and the Philistines kick their butts. It's a complete defeat. Not only that, Eli's sons are killed, and the Philistines take the Ark. And when the news gets back at Shiloh, Eli is waiting for news, and it's not funny, but he's waiting for the news about the battle, and the messenger comes, and the messenger says, "We lost, and your sons are dead." And he says, "Okay, what about the Ark?" Like, my sons are dead, who cares? They're bad. But as soon as he finds out that the Ark was captured, he falls over because he's old, and he breaks his neck and he dies. And it's complete, by the end of chapter 4, it's complete, utter humiliation. The scene shifts to chapters 5 and 6, chapter 5, where the Ark is now in Philistine territory. And long story short, when you read that, every place the Philistines take the Ark, it's like they got this thing of the God of Israel, and so they take it and they put it in the temple of their god Dagon. And every morning they find out, they go in to their temple, their big idol of their god is fallen face down before the Ark. So what does that tell you? God can take care of himself. That's the point. And every place they take the Ark to, that's same thing happens. And not only that, but some kind of disease breaks out in that town. And so what they decide, we need to send this Ark back to the Israelites because we don't want it. And in chapter 6, they send it back, and eventually the Israelites take it back, but because they're afraid of the Ark, because it has power, they kind of put it off into another town for a while. But then by the end of chapter 7, they rededicate themselves at Mitzpah. Now, given that's the second little bit, 4 to 7. Starting in chapter 8 is where we're introduced to Saul. And if you read the story of Saul, it basically 8 to 10 is you could say his rise to power. We're told that Israel wants a king to be like the other nations, which is not a good thing. And so even though Samuel says it's a bad idea, God says, hey, they want a king? Fine, give them a king. It's not going to go well. And so Saul is the one chosen because he looks like a king. He's tall, he's handsome. But right from the very beginning, if you read the story closely, he is fearful and he's weak. And right from the beginning, just kind of like a Shakespearean tragedy, you see right away that's Saul's tragic flaw, his fear. And he doesn't come across that well early on, but eventually he becomes king. In chapter 11, he has some early success, and you think, hey, maybe he's going to turn out pretty good. Not so much. Because starting in chapter 13, really all the way to the end of 1 Samuel, it is his spiral down the abyss. And it starts in chapter 13 where he's ready to go to battle with the Philistines at Michmash. And Samuel tells him to wait for him to do the sacrifice, but Samuel doesn't show up. Saul gets scared. He does the sacrifices himself. Not good. His son Jonathan, though, is the hero of the battle. And then Saul makes some other goof-ups that you can kind of see. But it really comes to a head in chapter 15 when Saul is told to make war with the Amalekites and to destroy them and to kill the king and to just destroy them all. And Saul doesn't do that. And because he disobeys again, at the end of chapter 15, Samuel tells him, God has rejected you as king. He's going to choose somebody different. And we're told at that point that the Spirit of the Lord leaves Saul and he sends a bad spirit upon Saul. Just a way of saying Saul's going to start going downward. The second half of 1 Samuel, starting 16 all the way to 31, is really, we're introduced to David. You find out that he's a shepherd. He doesn't seem like a kingly material, but God sees the heart. Chapter 17 is where David fights Goliath. And because of that, he becomes part of Saul's army, and he starts getting a lot of the praise. And lo and behold, Saul starts getting jealous, and like a paranoid tyrant, he wants to kill anybody who is a threat to his power. But meanwhile, David is friends with Saul's son Jonathan. And so basically, Saul tries to various ways to get rid of David. Creative ways, but David always comes through. And so it basically gets to the point where by the time you get to chapter 19 and 20, Saul's just trying to kill David. He's not just trying to push him out of the way to keep his own reputation. He's just, I want to kill David. And because of that, Jonathan and it's not Michal, Saul's daughter that he had given to David, they helped David escape. And from 21 all the way to 31, like I said, you can read it. It is, David is on the run. Saul, from time to time, gets his army and chases after David. It's kind of a problem. Saul kills innocent people trying to do this, trying to get him. And so 1 Samuel ends with another battle with the Philistines. David, to get away from Saul, had actually run away into the territory of the Philistines and was being protected by the Philistines, which from an Israelite perspective does not sound good. I mean, put yourself in the position of an Israelite. Saul's your king. You had David was one of his generals, but all of a sudden David has fled and is living with your enemies. That doesn't look too good. You have questions about David. But anyway, there's going to be this final battle, big battle between the Philistines and Israelites at the end of chapter 11. And David is enlisted to fight in the battle on the Philistine side, but as it turns out, they send him home. Lucky for him, so he doesn't fight against his own people. But Saul ends up losing the battle and committing suicide. The end of 1 Samuel. Okay, and like I said, there's a lot more stuff in there, but that's the narrative, that's the story. 2 Samuel then picks it up from there. In the real sense, 1 and 2 Samuel really are one story. 2 Samuel picks it up in the aftermath of Saul's death, and basically from chapters 1 to 5, you have the story of how David comes back from Philistine territory, and eventually wins the Israelites over to become their king. At first, he's welcomed back by the tribe of Judah, and he becomes the king of Judah, but the northern tribes are loyal to Saul's son, Ishbosheth. No, not Ishbosheth. Yes, Ishbosheth. And for a time, we're not told how long, there's kind of a civil war between David and Ishbosheth. But eventually Ishbosheth's general turns on him, and certain things happen. Long story short, Ishbosheth gets killed by some of his own men, and David eventually becomes king of all of Israel. And there's a lot of interesting storylines in there that we don't have time to go over, but it's fascinating. Starting in chapter 5, that's when he becomes king of all of Israel. He makes Jerusalem his capital. And from 5 to 10, we're told of a lot of his early successes. He defeats the Philistines in some battles. He brings the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. We're told of God's covenant with David, that there will always be a descendant of David on the throne. That's chapter 7. Chapter 8 talks about a number of his victories. Chapter 9, we're told that his kindness to Saul's grandson, a crippled guy named Mephibosheth, he was Jonathan's son, and David being the good godly king, he cares for him. And then he goes and he defeats the Ammonites in Syria. That's all 1 up through 10. Starting in chapter 11, and the assignment you're going to have, I'm going to have you look at the David and Bathsheba story a little more in detail. David and Bathsheba story is in chapter 11. I'll let you read that story, answer the questions. Long story short, David does a lot of bad things. Big time. And because of that, he basically commits adultery with Bathsheba, tries to cover it up in some horrible ways. He thinks he gets away with it, but Nathan the prophet in chapter 12 confronts him on it, calls him out on it. David and Bathsheba's illegitimate child dies, but David repents. And this is the biggest difference between David and Saul. On one hand, David does worse things, but the difference is Saul, when he does bad things, he doesn't really repent, and that makes things worse. David, when he does bad things, he gets caught, he fesses up, he acknowledges his sin, and he repents. That's why he's a man after God's own heart, and Saul wasn't. Okay, but nevertheless, that the consequence of his adultery with Bathsheba is going to dog him for the rest of his reign. And starting in chapter 13 all the way to the end, when you really think about it, most of the stuff we know about King David is some really horrible things, some horrible family dynamics. In 13, we're told that his son Amnon, who is in line for the throne, basically rapes his half-sister and gets away with it. And then we're told that another son, Absalom, because Amnon got away with it, Absalom, who was the brother of Tamar, holds a grudge and eventually murders Amnon to avenge his sister's disgrace, and then he flees, and that creates a problem. Eventually, Absalom is brought back to Jerusalem, but he still has more revenge he wants to do. And from chapters 14 to 19, basically, is the story of Absalom's revolt. Absalom stages a huge coup, a huge rebellion that makes David flee Jerusalem, and there's this long narrative about what happened. Eventually, Absalom is defeated. David comes back to Jerusalem to be king again. But you see, when you read 2 Samuel, is despite all the Sunday school stories you know about David, and he was a man of God's own heart, that's what it's clearly said. But the 2 Samuel does not shy away from the very real problems David had, and you see the underlying problems within Israel itself. So it was just on the verge of civil war, it would break out in civil war, then David comes back. But those underlying problems are going to come back big time when we get to 1 and 2 Kings. Okay? 2 Samuel ends with David comes back to the land. He establishes his kingship again. There's another rebellion in chapter 20 that he has to be put down, and goes from there. The very end of 2 Samuel, the last few chapters, there's a bunch of odds and ends, which are kind of interesting. But that's what is in 1 and 2 Samuel. And I highly recommend, just sit down and read the stories forget it's the Holy Bible, just read them and try to understand the narrative. And when you do that, the narrative is just so fascinating. There's so many things going on in the narrative. That's where the interest and fascination comes. Read the textbook for some basic information. Read the narrative. Really get what's going on. What I have on the file, there's going to be a 1 and 2 Samuel story chart, so you kind of see how it plays out. And then I also have kind of some of my own writing to help talk you through a little more about what's going on in these stories. So hopefully you'll enjoy it. They're fascinating. All right. Well, thank you very much for listening, and enjoy 1 and 2 Samuel.